Let me tell you about a man who stood against an empire with nothing but his conviction and paid the ultimate price for it. Rwanda, early 1900s. In the Virunga Mountains, mist clings to volcanic peaks, part of a social order centuries old. Deep in the mountains lives a man and a band of warriors. They would fracture the emerging colonial order with a single rebellious word: no. His name was Rukara, a sub-chief with no crown, no serious army, no institution to shield him. What he chooses next would cost him everything, but it would leave behind something far more durable than a life: immortality, a legend, a name that refuses to kneel. Rwanda, before colonial rule, was a kingdom of carefully balanced power. The Mwami, the king, sat at the top, but beneath him was a network of chiefs and sub-chiefs like Rukara, who managed land, collected tribute, and maintained order. These weren't just administrators, they were the living connection between the people and the throne, bound by obligation, ritual, and generations of precedent. And so the land itself seemed to hold memory, volcanic soil that had fed families for centuries, hills that marked boundaries everyone understood, a rhythm of seasons and obligations that needed no written law. Then came the Europeans, first the Germans in the 1890s, then the Belgians after World War I, and with them came new maps, new taxes, new masters, who didn't speak the language or understand the obligations. Sub-chiefs like Rukara found themselves caught between two worlds, the people who had always depended on them, and colonial officers who saw them as nothing more than tools for extraction. Colonial rule operated through a simple mechanism: find local leaders, give them impossible quotas, and let them carry the blame when people couldn't meet them. Rukara was ordered to collect taxes his people couldn't pay, provide labor for projects that served no local need, and enforce rules that contradicted everything his position had traditionally meant. Through a calculated maneuver, the colonizers didn't replace the old system, they captured it. They kept the titles, the ceremonies, the appearance of continuity, but hollowed out the obligations that had made those titles meaningful. The pressure built slowly. Families who had always paid tribute in crops or cattle were now expected to produce cash they'd never handled. And Rukara, like every sub-chief, had to choose: become the instrument of this extraction, or refuse and face the consequences. Most chose to obey. Survival. Rukara chose something else. We don't know the exact moment Rukara decides to resist. What we know is this: he stops collecting taxes and refuses to provide the laborers. He begins speaking openly against the colonial administration, not in secret, but in the spaces where sub-chiefs traditionally exercise authority: in courts, at gatherings, in front of the people who have always looked to him for guidance. And that's because he understood something fundamental. His authority did not come from the colonizers who co-opted his title. It came from the people whose lives were bound to his by generations of mutual obligation. The rebellion wasn't an army or a dramatic uprising. It was refusal, sustained and public. Other sub-chiefs watched. Some quietly supported him. Others reported him to the colonial authorities, afraid that his defiance would bring collective punishment. And they were right to be afraid, because that's exactly how colonial power worked. Make an example of one to control the rest. Rukara knew this. He did it anyway. The human cost wasn't abstract. Families associated with him faced harassment, his allies were removed from their positions, and the pressure on his community intensified precisely because he had dared to say no. The colonial response was methodical. First, they stripped him of his title, a purely administrative act that meant nothing to the people who still saw him as their sub-chief, but everything to the system that needed to demonstrate consequences. Then came arrest, detention, and death sentence by hanging. But Rukara refused to go alone. At his vulnerable moment, the last act was clear. A bayonet flashed, a colonizer fell, defiance endured still. Rukara's fall was designed to be a lesson. His family lost status. His allies lost positions. Rukara fell defending pride, land, and the right to stand. Yet the order taught people to kneel elsewhere, praying to holy distant lords, while that sacrifice was pushed aside and resistance was renamed sin forever. That's a surgical work aiming at quashing spirits. Rukara's story didn't end with his punishment. It went underground, carried forward in the kind of memory that institutions can't fully erase. Oral histories kept his name alive. Later generations, fighting their own battles against colonial rule and then post-colonial authoritarianism, invoked his example. And that's because resistance, even when it fails in the moment, creates a template for future refusal. What Rukara's story really reveals is how institutional power works, not through overwhelming force at every moment, but through making the cost of refusal too high for most people most of the time. Colonial rule in Rwanda succeeded not because it was militarily invincible, but because it was psychologically exhausting. It turned local leaders into instruments of their own people's oppression, then punished the few who refused to play along. But every system that operates through fear creates its own vulnerability. The moment someone refuses to be afraid, the whole mechanism is exposed. Rukara was that moment, and moments like that, once they happen, can never be completely undone. Rukara lost everything: his title, his freedom, his place in the official order. But he won something the colonizers couldn't take back: proof that refusal was possible. That's what makes his story matter, not just as history, but as a question that every generation has to answer for itself. What are you willing to lose to remain who you are? The empire he shook, unfortunately, remains. His name, however, is a testament that refusal to surrender is a human instinct.